Hi, this is Scott, Kilo Sierra 6, Delta Alpha Yankee, and this is part 2 of a 5-part series on You Need Comm Gear Now. In part 1, which was our intro, I talked about why I was doing this and who it was aimed at, but as a reminder, this is a series of videos done specifically for people that may have some experience with radios as a piece of issued equipment, but don't necessarily have that much knowledge or maybe even have no knowledge of what's going on in the amateur market. And right now, they're making decisions about comm gear or thinking about setting up a comm plan for what we talked about in part 1. And they need some answers. So this is going to be some advice as far as which services you might want to consider. And beyond that, later on in the series, which equipment you're going to want to consider along with that. So before we get to actually reviewing the radios and talking about the fun part, you first need to kind of have a little bit of an understanding of how amateur services are structured and what you need to keep in mind in terms of whether or not services are licensed or unlicensed and so on. So this video, and I've got the readers on because I'm actually using notes this time, is about amateur level services and legalities. So what we're going to talk about here is the 4 amateur radio services that are going to be I guess you'd call them the most popular and the most available services. There are more, but some are either very obscure, or there's not a lot of equipment available for them, or they're heavily regulated, or there's something that's going to get you in a heck of a lot of trouble. For instance, one service I'm not going to mention or recommend, well, I'll mention it, I have to talk about it now, but I'm not going to recommend it, is marine radio. If you want to get in trouble with unlicensed radio operations, start operating on marine radio. See how the Coast Guard handles that. They take a very dim view. So I'm talking about basically the 4 services that most people are using and you're going to be most likely to come across. 2 of these services are licensed and the other 2 are not. So in terms of the unlicensed services, we're going to be talking about CB, or Citizens Band. We're going to be talking about FRS, and I should do a little / GMRS because there's a little crossover between the 2 that you're going to encounter. And then amongst the licensed services, we're going to be talking about GMRS, General Mobile Radio Service, and ARS, or ham radio, which is amateur radio service. And nobody calls it ARS, by the way. Everybody calls it either ham or amateur radio. So let's first talk about the unlicensed services, because I'm going to recommend neither one of these as something to base your comm plan on. The first is Citizen Band, or CB. Everybody kind of knows what a CB radio is, and CB radios have their use as base units or mobiles, and they're good for picking up intel, but they're not a good radio to base a comm plan on because you can't really get any effective HTs that you can use. And what an HT radio is a little handheld like this, and the HT is an acronym that stands for handheld transceiver, not handy talkie. And what an HT is a self-contained small portable radio that contains the power supply, has an antenna attached, and all the operating circuitry to be a standalone, fully functional radio that's highly portable. You don't have to plug any peripheries in or anything. This is something you can put in a pouch or clip to a belt, turn it on, and you are good to go. So HTs are tremendously popular, especially for people that are entering into the world of radio, and they're going to be particularly popular for people that are entering into radio for the purposes a lot of you are entering into it now, and that is something that you can put on a plate carrier, load-bearing harness, or attached to a belt underneath a cover garment. So you're going to need an effective HT. CB cannot deliver that. Without getting too technical, because of the frequency range that CBs operate on, they require an antenna that is so long that in order to be effective, it makes an HT completely impractical. Your antenna would need to be massively long. There are some HTs out there. I have a couple, and they just don't work. They just don't. They're not terribly effective at extremely short distances. They're good. If you need a radio to throw in your purse and operate in a truck stop, they're pretty good for making contacts with drivers, but beyond that, they're not terribly effective. So like I said, for building a tactical comm plan around, not the radio to go with. The next unlicensed radio I'm going to talk about is FRS radios, which is Family Radio Service, and I'm talking about radios that existed prior to 2017. A lot of us have a bunch of these bouncing around. And these are not something you want to build a comm plan around, specifically not this type of radio, which is called a blister pack radio. We call them that because they come in a clear clamshell package, usually sell in a pair, and you find them at Walmart, Best Buy, all over the place, and they will have kind of some outlandish claims on the marketing material, saying they'll go, oh, this thing will go 27 or 37 miles. They don't. From a pure practical standpoint, these things are good for a couple blocks in an urban environment, and they don't pack very many features. They might have NOAA weather on there, but you don't have the ability to program these with additional like public safety frequencies for monitoring. They tend, because of their design, the blister pack type radios. And here's your first clue. If it's a fixed antenna that cannot be removed and it's a radio about this size, it's probably going to have a 2-watt maximum output and half a watt on most of the channels. And here we're talking about in terms of the wattage, just the typical output. A decent HT is usually 5 watts. Some are 8, some go all the way up to 10. This one on some channels will do close to 9 actually. But these, very low output, and that's going through a very compromised fixed antenna that's not terribly good. So while these things are cheap and inexpensive, they're not something to build a comm plan around. They are useful, however, if you select GMRS as a service that you're going to operate with, because there's crossover. Now, since 2017, you still see these blister pack radios on the shelves. But now they are called a different thing. They're called a GMRS radio. But I want you to understand, and I will, when I get to the radio portion of this series of videos, explain that while this, in this little tiny format, may be a GMRS radio, it is not anything close to being as capable as this GMRS radio. There is a true difference. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the radios. So when it comes to FRS and the little blister pack radios that you buy at the box stores, forget those. You're going to be wanting to look at something that's a little more upscale, and that's going to take you into a licensed service. Now, real quick before I talk about the licensed services, I want to talk about the concept of licensing in general. Because there's a lot of folks that have the mindset, and there actually is an exemption within the FCC rules that states, it doesn't state, I'm going to paraphrase it, because accuracy is important. You can find it pretty easily on FCC, in the FCC website. But essentially it says this: in the event of an emergency, when no other means of communication is possible, you can use any available radio service to transmit a call for help. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say you're out in the middle of the country. You encounter what looks like a traffic stop that you're driving up on, but all you see is a patrol car and the lights are turning, and you see an officer and he's down and there's no one else around. You run up to the scene. If you were to grab his radio and transmit a call for help, okay, so he's got a handheld on his belt, maybe a mic clipped to his lapel. If you grabbed his mic and you says, help, 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 this officer is down on the ground, he needs help. Technically, you're transmitting on a service that you're not allowed to transmit on. However, that's an actual emergency right there. Now, there's some that will say, well, if you have a cell phone that could make it, screw that. You get what I'm talking about. That's an emergency. Just because your feelings are hurt and you want to use a radio service, that's not an emergency. So if you transmit on these licensed services, if you use these licensed services without a proper call sign and licensing, you are technically committing, well, is it a crime? Is it not a crime? It depends on who you talk to. Could you get caught or won't you get caught? Who knows? There's not a whole lot of people that are getting gaffled up for getting on a ham radio frequency and just chatting away. But what I will say is this: you are going to piss off everyone in the radio community by doing so. Now, if that's what you want to do, great, do that. But if you actually think things are going to go sideways and you need communications and you need to be setting up comm networks with people and being able to have some kind of infrastructure to call for help or assistance or coordinate the activities of others, and you want to start off by running around pissing off everyone in the radio community, by all means, go right ahead, because if you jump on an amateur radio frequency, and I'm going to tell you something else, if you jump on a GMRS repeater and you start acting the fool and you won't give up a call sign, first off, no one's going to talk to you. They're going to talk at you, and they're going to say things to you that are going to hurt your feelings. And you're not going to be setting up a comm plan at this time. You're just a jerk. Now, let me take it another direction, though. Let's say, because ultimately, if you're going to buy this gear, you need to practice with it. You need to learn how it works, okay? Now, I understand this is a bit of a departure, but it's an important point to mention this. If you just buy a radio, program it up, charge it up, and put it in a box and wait for doomsday, when doomsday comes and it comes time to use that radio, you are not going to rise. Basically, it's not going to be like a movie where you rise to the occasion to win the day. You're going to default to your trading experience. That's the way it is. That's the way it is with guns. That's the way it is with hand-to-hand combat. That's the way it is with everything. You do not rise to the occasion. You default to your current level of training and experience. If you have not trained or used this radio at all, you are going to turn it on and start talking. And if it's to someone that's 400 yards away from you, you're probably going to have a successful result. What happens when you get in the foothills? Do you know how to shoot a signal through a saddle, for instance? Do you know how to find? Do you even know the fact that your antenna needs to see another antenna and what that means? Do you know how terrain features work in terms of blocking a signal? And do you know how to use those terrain features to extend your signal? These are all things you only learn by actually using the radio in practice. Also, just being able to use and operate the radio, being able to enter a frequency, being able to switch from memory to VFO mode, being able to input a frequency, being able to change your power settings, because your output settings are going to need to be adjusted. We'll talk when we get into operations how not putting out a signal to a certain distance can be a valuable thing. There's a lot of things you need to know about this. It's by no means as complicated as learning how to operate a weapon system. I get that. But you still need to use this gear. You don't just, and unfortunately there are too many people that do that. They just they try to find a technological solution to a training problem, or they just throw money at the problem. They just buy gear. I know people that have piles and piles and piles of mint condition, brand new, in the wrapper, good gear that they have not taken out of the wrapper and probably never will. They'll probably someday, hopefully nothing bad ever happens and this whole crisis passes and we're all fine and dandy 20 years from now, and these people croak, their garage sale is going to be awesome to go to because they're going to have brand new mint condition gear on the shelf that they never took out and never used. I can't really convince or compel people that have that mindset to do anything about it. At some point, something may resonate enough with them for them to get up off their ass and do something about it. I was in a similar position many years ago with one of these radios. I was at the time using these FRS radios. I wanted something that was a little more advanced, if you could consider a Baofeng UV5R advanced and high tech. I thought it was at the time. And I bought one. Okay, and I had it for fully 2 years before I did anything with it. I programmed it up. I mostly used it as a scanner. I did some stuff that I probably shouldn't have done with it on the FRS side of things, but I thought I was good to go. And then again, I didn't mess with it as much as I should have. And I had somebody kind of mention the analogy of you wouldn't buy a gun, buy a bunch of ammunition, load the magazines up, throw it in a case, put it in a closet, and never touch it, and then expect when something went down, you'd be ready to go. That resonated with me. That's what got in my head and made me think, oh, I need to be actually using this gear. I need to learn about it. And that's when I went out and got a license, and I started moving into radio, and it sort of hooked me, and I'm doing what I'm doing right now, talking to you. And I hope at some point, if you're one of those people, that something does eventually resonate with you in that direction. But chances are, if you watch the video to this point, you're probably already there. So let's move on to the license services, because in order to practice with this gear, you're going to need to get a license. If you get a license, people will talk to you. You can start developing those connections. You can start networking. You can start meeting people within your community that are tied in and have radio networks already set up. So when it comes time to use these radios as a decentralized form of communication in order to gather intelligence and communicate with others without interference from a nefarious or tyrannical government, you'll know what to do. So let's talk about the two licensed services with that sidebar out of the way. Sorry for that little diversion, but I hope it resonated with you. So when it comes to licensed services, we have two. We have GMRS, General Mobile Radio Service, and we have ARS, Amateur Radio Service, or ham radio. Now, let me talk about ham radio first, because that will inform our thinking when we get to GMRS. This is going to be a real 30,000 foot view of amateur radio. I guarantee you, having said that, we're going to have some people that'll go, well, you know, amateur radio does have some limited access to HF. Cool your jets. We're just talking about entry-level stuff here, okay? So if you're interested, so when it comes to ham radio, it's going to involve this. There's going to be a $35 licensing fee that'll cover you and you as an individual and your call sign for 10 years. There are 3 classifications within amateur radio. There is technician class, general class, and amateur extra class. Each of those classes requires a test. You cannot take, you don't jump backwards, you only move forward, okay? So you have to kind of work through each of these to achieve the next level. Everybody pretty much is going to start off with technician class, and the way it's going to work is you're going to go to an exam site, usually run by a radio club. You're going to pay them a test fee, which is, in our case, I think in our club, is $15. You're going to sit down, you're going to take a 35 question test. I believe it's 35 questions. Feel free to correct me on that one, by the way. It's going to be taken from a 300 question pool. That pool lasts for a number of years. During that time, all of the questions and all of the answers to the questions are published and known. So technically you could go through and memorize all 300 answers to all 300 questions, sit down and take the test, call it a day. It can be done within 8 days. I've done it. I've heard people do it in a shorter period of time. In an 8-day period, I started on a Wednesday and I tested the following Thursday. I memorized all of the questions, or all of the answers to 300 questions, sat down, took the test, got 100%, got my technician ticket. Did I learn anything off of that? Yeah, I did along the way. And there is another route you can take. You could take a class that a radio club might put on. There are classes that are available online. There are books that you can buy and read. There are apps that you can get for your phone. The simplest method, memorize the questions or memorize the answers, take the test, learn how to use the radio from people in that radio club afterwards. If it's a good club, what they'll do is when you pass the test, they'll give you a complimentary 1-year membership to the club. Start meeting people in the club, you know, talk to those folks, and trust me, if you want to know about how to operate radio, get on a repeater, throw your call sign out, operate, you know, responsibly, and just ask a question. Hey, can someone tell me how to do this? People will stumble over themselves trying to answer your question for you. They are very accommodating in terms of answering questions. So that is one way of getting into radio. Now, what does this get you? As a technician level operator, you have access to, in terms of privileges, see each of the classes, you get more and more of the available amateur radio bands. For amateur radio, yes, you get some HF capability, but it's not particularly effective and it's not a really useful band anyway. But what we're mainly talking about is 2-meter FM line of sight communications. So we're talking VHF, UHF, and we're talking the same kind of frequency ranges that public safety uses and the same kind of radios that public safety uses. Not in the same areas of the bands, but the same approach. So you can have a mobile in your car. You can have a mobile converted to a base at your home. You can talk radio to radio. You can do repeater operations where you can use a handheld radio like this to transmit to a repeater that's at a high location, and then it duplexes that signal and then sends it out at a much higher wattage to a larger geographic area. So you can take a little HT like this, that radio to radio, you're only going to get a couple miles. You can get 80, 90, 100 miles out of it using a repeater. In fact, our repeater, I can hit with this radio. It will go up to so the signal when I transmit will go up to an antenna that's at 7,516 feet. It will then forward that out at 100 watts throughout the entire San Joaquin Valley, and I can talk to people from Visalia. I can talk to people all the way down south of Bakersfield at the Grapevine. I can talk all the way out to the coast to people that are in Templeton, Paso Robles. I can talk all the way up to Turlock, lower parts of Stockton. So you can get out a pretty good ways with this. So that's technician level operations. Now, when you get to general, you can have access to HF. And what HF is that's strategic comms. Well, these are tactical comms. Strategic comms, we're talking hemispheric at this point. You're going to be operating differently and with a different type of equipment. The equipment is exponentially more expensive. It's much larger, much more difficult to operate. It's not anything that's entry level, and it's probably not anything that's going to interest you at this moment. But do know that with those types of radios, you don't need to rely on a repeater. You can set up a repeater, or rather, without setting up a repeater, you can, by skipping a signal off of the ionosphere, and of course this is limited to atmospheric effect, weather, time of day, a lot of conditions affect your signal, but if you have good signal propagation, I can talk from Visalia to Nova Scotia, I can talk down into Central and South America, I can talk way out into the Pacific Islands, just merely by pointing the antenna in a certain direction and then skipping that signal along the ionosphere. I can also sort of reverse the process and fire the signal instead of shooting it at an angle to circumvent the globe. I can shoot straight up and scatter the signal, just literally ricochet it right back down and be able to transmit, or rather send a signal out in a 400-mile radius. That's called near vertical incidence skywave. That's where things get real interesting from a tactical perspective. So if you are thinking maybe of getting into radio, but you want to go like next level elite class kind of capabilities, ham radios for you. You want to start thinking about doing stuff like that. And there's all kinds of other things. Literally anything you want to do or can do within radio, you can do within amateur radio. It's amazing. I could sit here, if I laid out all of the features and all the things you could possibly do, this video would be 25 hours long. It would go, and probably longer than that, in fact. I'd miss a few things. So, but from just an entry level, I'm a guy that doesn't know much about consumer electronics. One option, go down, get licensed as a tech, do the memorize the question thing. You can close the entire process out in a week, week and a half, and be good to go. That's an option. But there is another that's even easier than that. And if you're not looking at becoming a hobby grade or a hobbyist within radio, you're merely concerned with just comms, and you want good comms, and you want the most versatile comms without having to get into a lot of excessive study and a lot of excessive equipment. GMRS is kind of where it's at. Now, what GMRS does, my best description of GMRS would be technician class amateur radio. Is sort of a light version of that. Whereas I didn't talk a lot about the different bands and whatnot that was available to the technician class, but well, I think I did. I mentioned similar to public safety, they have VHF, UHF. What GMRS is they have taken a section of the UHF band, 462 to 467 megahertz. They set that aside. Now, it was previously set aside for these little FRS radios. They've added a little extra channel allocation to that, and they changed the rules a little bit. So again, before 2017, the FRS, GMRS radios were limited to fixed antenna. There were some issues related to the battery, whether or not it could be rechargeable, whether or not it could just have alkalines, limited features within the radio, 2-watt output. They changed the rules in 2017 to make the service and the radios much more versatile. Now what you get, and I'm going to compare it to an amateur radio. Okay, so here we have a ham radio, 5-watt output. This one only has a 200 channel capability, but I have others here that are 1,000 channel. I have some that are 3,000 channel memory channels available to them. 5-watt, this will do VHF, UHF. This is a Wouxun KG935 Golf. It is a 5-watt HT. It is GMRS specific, so it's limited to the range of 462 to 467 megahertz. It is capable of all the way up to 9 watts of output power. It has an removable and upgradable antenna capability. It is everything that the amateur radio HTs within the UHF spectrum will do, in terms, not necessarily in terms of frequencies, but in terms of capabilities. This will do. 999 memory channels in this. So what I can do with this radio within the GMRS service, and I haven't even talked about the service yet, but I'm kind of explaining how you can see, oh, we've got all of that kind of stuff, but with just a few limitations, without a written test. That's the biggest attraction to GMRS. Here's GMRS. Let me just lay this out as quickly as possible. $35 fee. So you pay $35 to the FCC. There are a few things you have to establish. I'll do a separate video on how to get a GMRS license. There are videos out there on how to do it, though. It's a very simple process. This is how it worked for me. The whole process took 48 hours. Went to the FCC. I got a thing called an FRN. Went to the FCC site, and I used that FRN to identify myself to pay $35 to the FCC. Within 48 hours, I got my call sign, which is WRTI 407, and can now operate on GMRS. I'm now a licensed GMRS radio operator. That's it. No written test. The license fee covers me for 10 years. But here's the really cool thing. Whereas ham, that license fee and that testing covers you and you alone. With GMRS, it covers everyone in your immediate family. Essentially, all you need to do is just cut out cousins, and everyone else is covered. Brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, daughters, grandparents, aunts, uncles, all the way along the line. In-laws, the in-law variant of every single one of those is covered under your call sign. So with one call sign, I essentially covered my entire family with my call sign. And the way I have that worked out, it's WRTI 407, and then they have an alphanumeric identifier after that. So for instance, one of them might be WRTI 407 alpha. Is one group of people or one specific person, and everyone is now covered. Now this is a more expensive radio. I have some cheaper radios that I have as handouts to the people in my family and friends circle, and we've set up a nice little network. Now what can you do? So that kind of covers what the license is and what the service is, but what can the radios do? I mentioned, and I'm getting to the end of a very long video, so here's where things get a little, I start to wander a bit, so I'm going to try to tighten it up a little bit because we're almost done, okay? GMRS is basically 22 channels with 8 repeater channels. It's 462 to 467 megahertz. Amongst the 22 simplex channels, that's radio to radio, one of the problems you'll obviously see is if there's only 22 channels available, there's going to be a lot of people walking on top of each other within a certain geographic area. But you can discriminate from those signals by using something called the CTCSS tone that can be applied to these radios. And what it is a privacy code is all it is. It's not encryption, but what it does is it squelches out any other signal except for a person that is sending a matching subaudible tone on their transmission. So you put in a little 3-digit plus a decimal, well, 4-digit with a decimal number, and no, because of 69.3, there's codes. You just enter in a little code, and essentially this will detect that code. If it doesn't detect the code, it will not it will not send a signal through the speaker. it'll receive it because you can see on the status bar, but you're not going to hear it. So it just squelches it out so you don't have to listen to unwanted radio traffic. So privacy codes there. Then you have 8 repeater channels, and you can do the same thing with the privacy codes there. So now you have the ability with this radio to hit a repeater and then broadcast over a larger geographic area. So it makes this radio extremely effective in terms of the distance in which you can reach with it. So GMRS. Is GMRS the optimal service to get involved in if you're entry level, if you're just getting into radio? I'm going to say, and that's why we ended up here, GMRS is definitely 100% my top recommendation. If you plan on becoming or getting deeper into radio and you want to be able to do strategic communications with HF and really be able to get out there and reach like hemispherically with radio, then you're going to be looking at ham. If you're looking for good quality radios that you can put on a plate carrier, clip to a belt, or throw into a pouch, GMRS is going to be the way to go. You can set up one call sign, will cover all the people in your orbit. With that call sign, you'll be able to get out and practice with the radios, learn how to use them, and become effective with them. Now, I'm going to throw one other, and let me add one other thing in that I did mention. In addition to those channels, so let me tell you, for instance, on this radio here, I have not only the 22 simplex channels, I also have for each of those simplex channels 4 privacy coded channels. I have 8 repeater channels in here that are set up as blanks. I have repeaters that are actually working within the area, and even with that, I still haven't broken 100 memory channels on this. Now this has a 999 channel capability as far as memory channels. What do I do with the other 800 channels? You fill them up with channels that you use for monitoring. You won't be able to transmit on them. Fire, police, city, ambulance, anything you can imagine that is analog. I won't talk about P25 or digital modes or any of that other stuff, but if it can be received with an analog radio, you can plug it in here. So now you have the ability, and you can even put ham radio frequencies in here. You won't be able to transmit on them, but you can monitor them. So now you not only have a device where you can talk and communicate with other people in your orbit, you also have an intel gathering device that's going to allow you to listen in to what's going on with the fire, police, sheriff's department, ambulances, public works, road department, all kinds of things to figure out what the heck is going on in your area. If you have the road department going out and all of a sudden they're setting up horseshoe barricades and all this kind of stuff, you notice fire department trucks are starting to stage up, and the police are suddenly all starting to show up in one particular location. You may go, yeah, it's someplace I might not want to go. So all of these things can be helpful towards keeping you aware of what's going on around you and be able to pass that on. Not to mention being able to listen into ham radio nets. You can pick up intel that people are using, because there's a layered approach to radio that I've talked about elsewhere, where you have strategic and tactical, and you have the people doing the strategic stuff communicating well outside of your geographic area and then passing that down locally at the tactical level through 2 meter and 70 centimeter radios. But again, I'm digressing. But to wrap it all up in a nutshell, of the 4 radio services I recommend, probably the most practical and the easiest to get into is GMRS. I'll do a GMRS specific entry-level video later. I have some stuff already on my channel. There are other videos that you can find elsewhere, and then start getting into the wonderful world of GMRS. But I'm going to leave you with one last thing as far as skirting the rules, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. Now, I mentioned that this GMRS radio, it will not transmit anywhere outside of 462 to 467 megahertz. It just won't do it. But if you knew how many people ran GMRS with one of these radios, it would astonish you. Well, this is a GMRS specific radio, and if you want to be 100% legal, you use a GMRS Part 95 Echo certified radio for GMRS operations. However, there are ham radios that are set up to do what's called out-of-band transmission. For instance, the Baofeng here transmits well outside of the allocated ham bands, and in fact will transmit within the GMRS range as well as the ham radio. So a lot of people, what they do is they run radios like this, and they plug the GMRS frequencies into that. You will run across people that are recommending that you do that. Now, does it do you end up with a much more effective radio in the end that'll do a lot more things? Because if you did that, again, same with this Yaesu radio here that's set up with what's called a Mars cap modification. So this radio could conceivably transmit on GMRS frequencies. It could also transmit on what's called MURS frequencies, which is multiple use radio system. It could transmit into aspects of the business radio service. There's a lot of different areas where this could transmit, none of which are legal in any way, shape, or form. But boy, what a degree of flexibility if that were legal for a day. Imagine that. Imagine all of the different things you could do. So, and the great thing is, well, I guess not the great thing, it's a horrible idea for people to be doing these things. But if you were to transmit with this radio, no one would have any idea whether or not you were using a ham radio or a GMRS radio to do so. All they're going to care about is a call sign. No call sign, no candy. So if I were to maybe select the GMRS radio service, get my call sign and be able to operate legally on that call sign, maybe with the radio, I might consider some people might consider some other things. I own GMRS radios. I only use GMRS radios for that purpose. But some would just buy something like this. And then the crazy thing is, as they progress through, and maybe they decide at some point to get their tech ticket and become a ham radio operator as well, they don't have to get a new radio. They just have the same radio. It's just food for thought. Food for thought. I'm not recommending you do that, of course. That would be bad. That would be wrong. But I am saying it's done. It's done a lot, and it's a petty little nitpicking thing, and it really doesn't, in the greater scheme of things, so long as you're operating responsibly, utilizing a call sign, and people know who the heck you are, and you're not doing anything illegal over the radio with your transmissions, the equipment that you're using, so long as it's not sending out any spurious emissions that are interfering with other people's radios, so long as you're not interfering with a frequency that's in use by public safety, you know, no autopsy, no foul, right? Okay, this has been one hell of a long video, and I hope I did overly confuse you. I hope I didn't beat the dead horse and run him into the ground too much. But that is, not in a nutshell, but in a very fat, bulging package, amateur level services and the legalities therein. I probably missed a few things somewhere along the way, but I think I got a pretty good overview of it in the total. So with that, we'll move on to the next one here, and let me see what that's going to be. We're going to talk about operations next. We're going to talk about things that you can do with the radios, different types of radios to consider. It's not going to be, well, we'll get to it when we get there. We're going to cover some radio nomenclature and start kind of getting in the direction of selecting a radio and the one that's going to work best for you in your operational environment. So with that, I am going to bring it to a close at this point. My voice is about shot, and I'm getting tired. So